He was drowning in the pond, and no one could help him in time. But a girl from the Apache tribe jumped into the water and saved the cowboy's son. They thought that was the end of the story. But when the town found out about their secret friendship, everything changed. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The afternoon sun lay heavy upon the prairie, pouring its heat over the cracked earth until the very air shimmered. Dust rose in long clouds behind the herd that moved slowly toward the watering hole, the sound of lowing cattle and the steady thump of hooves creating a rhythm that echoed across the empty land. Daniel Hayes rode near the front, his hat pulled low against the glare, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. It had been a long day, one of those days where the land itself seemed intent on wringing every last drop of strength from a man, but this was his life, and he carried it with the resignation of someone who knew no other way. His boy Tommy trotted alongside, small boots kicking up dust as he hurried near the bank where the herd would drink. The pond, fed by underground springs that had not yet dried under the relentless sun, was a muddy pool, its edges slick with trampled earth and animal tracks. For the cattle it was life itself, and for the boy it was an adventure waiting to unfold. Tommy bent to chase dragonflies, his laughter thin in the heat, his shadow a flicker on the scorched ground. His father, focused on guiding the herd, only glanced up now and then, proud of the boy's energy, blind for the moment to the danger beneath his small feet. The bank gave way without warning. One moment Tommy was reaching toward a reed that bent lazily in the breeze, and the next his body pitched forward, arms flailing, a startled cry tearing from his throat. The water swallowed him with a splash that seemed far too small for the enormity of the moment. He resurfaced once, mouth open in a choked gasp, eyes wide with terror, and then the murky water pulled him down again. Daniel saw it too late. The herd pressed around him, dust choking his breath as he spurred his horse toward the pond. His heart pounded with a fear sharper than any bullet he had faced, for this was no enemy he could fight with his rifle or his fists. He shouted, words breaking apart in panic as he threw himself from the saddle, boots sinking into the mud as he ran for the water. But even as he struggled forward, he knew he would not reach the boy in time. From the shadows of the mesquite trees came a figure that few noticed until she was already moving. Ayanna, a young woman of the Apache people, had been gathering herbs near the water, her basket half full, her path far from the eyes of the town. She saw the boy fall, and she did not hesitate. The basket tumbled from her hand, spilling its contents into the dust as she sprinted across the cracked earth. Without pause, she dove into the pond, the surface breaking around her as she disappeared beneath the murk. The water was heavier than it looked. Mud clung to her skirts, the weight dragging her down as she fought against the pull. Her arms reached blindly until her hands found a small, limp body, and with a strength born of desperation, she pushed upward. The boy broke the surface first, coughing, sputtering, his cries muffled by water, but alive. Ayanna's head followed, hair plastered to her face, breath ragged as she kicked against the pull of the pond and hauled him toward the bank. Daniel fell to his knees in the mud, arms outstretched as Ayanna pushed the boy into his grasp. For a terrible second the child hung limp, water streaming from his mouth and nose, and then a ragged cough shook his frame. His small chest rose with air again, each gasp sharp but certain, and he clung instinctively to the woman who had dragged him from the pond. His fingers curled in her soaked vest, trembling, unwilling to let go. The other cow hands had gathered, some standing frozen in astonishment, others muttering under their breath. Their eyes darted between the boy, the drenched Apache woman, and the figure of their boss, who looked as if the ground itself had shifted beneath him. Daniel pulled his son close, pressing his face into the boy's wet hair, but his eyes could not tear away from the sight of the woman who had saved him. Ayanna stood in silence, water dripping from her clothes, her chest still heaving with the effort of the rescue. She looked at the child once more, her dark eyes soft with something that spoke deeper than gratitude or pride. Then she turned, the murmurs of the men following her as she bent to retrieve her fallen basket. The herbs were ruined, covered in mud, but she gathered them anyway, her hands moving with steady purpose. Daniel reached for words, for something that could contain the storm inside him. But nothing came. His pride, his upbringing, The years of distrust sown between his people and hers pressed like a weight against his chest. He had lived his life with clear lines, us and them, friends and enemies, safe and dangerous. Now those lines blurred in the mud before him, in the image of his son coughing back life in the arms of a woman he had been taught to keep at a distance. Ayanna did not wait for thanks. She lifted the strap of her basket to her shoulder, squared her back, and walked away toward the prairie, each step carrying her farther from the stunned silence that trailed behind her. Daniel watched her go, the sunlight catching on the beads in her braids, her figure shrinking until the dust swallowed her whole. The men muttered, some shaking their heads. One spat into the dirt, muttering about savage luck, while another crossed himself quietly, whispering that the boy's life had been spared by the grace of something greater. None dared to speak directly to Daniel, who still clutched his son with a grip so fierce his knuckles whitened. Tommy, weak but alive, buried his face against his father's chest, though his small voice whispered the memory of the arms that had pulled him from the water. The sun sank lower, its light gilding the surface of the pond with a shimmer that belied the danger it had held. The cattle drank without concern, tails flicking lazily, unaware of the drama that had unfolded. Life went on in the indifferent rhythm of the West, where men struggled and children played, where dust and water, death and survival danced their eternal cycle. As evening crept across the land, Daniel led his son back toward the ranch. His steps were heavy, each one weighed down by the image of the girl walking away. He carried Tommy in his arms, the boy's head resting against his shoulder, the heat of the day slowly giving way to the cool breath of night. Behind him the herd moved in slow procession, their shadows long and wavering in the last light. But in Daniel's mind the silence of the prairie carried a new sound, the splash of water, the ragged breaths of a woman who had risked everything, and the quiet dignity with which she had walked away. It haunted him, not with fear, but with a question that would not let him rest. That night in the small house where the lamplight flickered against rough-hewn walls, Daniel sat beside his son's bed. Tommy slept fitfully, his small hands curled around the blanket, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of recovery. Daniel reached out once to smooth the boy's hair, his hand trembling, and found his thoughts drifting again to Ayanna. He wondered where she slept, whether she had dried her clothes by a fire, whether she thought of the boy she had saved. Sleep would not come easily to him. The West was a land of hard men and harder rules, a place where gratitude was often buried beneath suspicion. But that night Daniel Hayes could not ignore the truth. His boy lived because of her. Whatever else might come, he knew this was a debt that no gold, no words, no gesture could repay. And somewhere in the quiet of the prairie night, Ayanna lay beneath the canvas of her small shelter, the memory of the boy's desperate grasp still imprinted on her arms. She closed her eyes, not seeking recognition or thanks, but only the knowledge that life had been preserved. For her, that was enough. Yet fate, like the restless wind that moved through the grasses, had only begun to weave their stories together. The days that followed the rescue passed with the restless rhythm of the frontier, yet something had shifted in the Hayes household. The prairie itself seemed unchanged. The cattle still moved in dusty herds across the open land. The sun still burned mercilessly during the day, and the coyotes still howled under the cold light of the moon. But within the walls of the small ranch house, a quiet echo of the pond lingered. Daniel Hayes had not spoken much of what had happened. He carried his work as he always did, mending fences, tending to stock, riding out before dawn, and returning long after dusk. But the memory of Ayanna haunted him in silence. He remembered the way her hands had pulled his son from the muddy water, the way she had walked away without a word, and the image had etched itself into him with a permanence he could not shake. For Tommy, the experience was different. Children seldom hold on to fear for long. Instead, they cling to the figure who saves them. In the evenings, when the air cooled enough to allow the family to gather near the lamplight, Tommy often grew restless, his mind wandering back to the pond. He spoke of the girl from the water with a mixture of awe and curiosity, sometimes in whispers to himself, sometimes in bursts of excited recollection. He would lie on his bed and imagine her braids catching the light, her dark eyes calm as she held him against the pull of the pond. To him she was more than a fleeting figure. She was the presence that had returned breath to his lungs. One morning when Daniel rode out early, Tommy slipped away from the ranch house. His grandmother busied herself with the chores of the kitchen, her back turned, the clatter of pans and the smell of frying corn thick in the air. The boy, quick and silent, darted out the door, clutching a small apple in his hand, and made his way across the prairie path. He followed the faint trail of footprints and broken grasses until he reached the edge of the mesquite grove where Ayanna lived. Her dwelling was a modest camp, a small canvas stretched against poles, a fire pit ringed with stones, and bundles of herbs hanging from a rope. Ayanna was bent over a pot, her hands moving with practiced patience as she ground roots into powder. She looked up at the sound of small footsteps and found the boy standing there, cheeks flushed, holding out the apple as if it were an offering. For a long moment, neither moved. She saw the same wide eyes that had stared at her beneath the pond's surface, the same face she had pulled gasping into the air. She accepted the apple with quiet grace, gesturing for him to sit near the fire. Tommy returned often after that. Each visit was unspoken, each journey across the prairie carried in secrecy. He would sneak away with little gifts: an apple, a worn drawing, a stick of candy saved from town, and in return Ayanna gave him stories. She told him of the spirits of the wind that raced through the canyons, of the animals whose tracks told the stories of survival, of the stars that guided her people long before railroads and telegraphs scarred the land. She taught him how to listen to the call of a bird and know if danger was near, how to tell coyote tracks from those of a dog, how to sit still enough that even the skittish rabbits would emerge from the brush. The boy soaked up her words as if they were water after a drought. To him, she became more than a rescuer. She became a sister, a teacher, someone who offered a world beyond the fences and rules of the ranch. He laughed freely in her presence, asked endless questions, and returned each time with a heart fuller than when he had left. But the prairie is not a place where secrets stay buried long. In town, whispers began to stir. Men in the saloon leaned across tables, their voices low but sharp, speaking of the boy who slipped away to the Apache camp. Women at the mercantile traded glances and muttered that Daniel Hayes, once respected, allowed his son to spend time with one of them. Some voices carried pity, others scorn, but all fed the slow-burning fire of suspicion that thrived in small, tight-knit communities. Daniel himself noticed the changes. He returned from long rides to find Tommy glowing with stories he could not fully explain, his hands dirty with earth, his pockets filled with strange stones or feathers. At first, Daniel did not press him. He was grateful enough to see his son smiling again after the shadow of the pond. But the truth could not stay hidden. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence, he caught sight of his son slipping away across the field. He followed at a distance, careful not to reveal himself, and saw the boy vanish into the mesquite grove. When he drew nearer, he saw Ayanna's figure by the fire, and he understood. His feelings were a tangle of conflict. Gratitude still weighed on him, the kind that could never be repaid. But alongside it rose the hard voice of pride and the inherited suspicion of his people. He watched as his son laughed with the girl, as if the fear of death had already transformed into a bond that could not be broken. Something in him softened at the sight, yet another part hardened, wary of the judgment of neighbors and kin. It was his mother who gave voice to what others only whispered. She was a stern woman, her hair gray but her bearing proud, the widow of a rancher who had lived and died with the certainty that white settlers carved their place on the frontier through strength alone. When she heard the rumors, when she saw the boy sneaking off, her anger was swift. To her, it was not gratitude but shame. She saw her grandson clinging to a woman whose people had long been branded as enemies, and in her grief for her dead daughter-in-law, she felt her memory threatened. She confronted Daniel with harsh words, insisting that he put a stop to it before the town judged them all. Daniel stood torn, his loyalty divided between his mother's demands and his son's joy. At night he sat alone on the porch, listening to the cicadas hum, staring at the stars with a heaviness in his chest. He knew his mother was not wrong about the eyes of the town. He knew the West was a place where reputations were as fragile as glass, where a man could lose respect as quickly as he lost cattle to drought. Yet when he looked at his son, he saw life returned, the shadows of fear gone from his small face, replaced by laughter. He could not deny what Ayanna had given him, and it was not just the rescue at the pond, it was the restoration of his boy's spirit. Meanwhile, Ayanna herself remained apart, unaware of the depth of the storm brewing beyond the mesquite. For her, the visits of the boy were simple gifts, moments of warmth in a life often marked by distance. She had not asked for his company, nor sought to draw him away from his kin. Yet she accepted him, as she would any child in need, and found in his curiosity a balm for her own solitude. She knew enough of the white settlers to expect little trust, but she had not anticipated the fierce affection of a boy who saw her not as other, but simply as Ayanna. The prairie nights grew cooler as summer edged toward autumn. The days shortened, the wind carried the scent of dried grass and the promise of colder months to come. Life on the ranch continued, but within its rhythms an undercurrent grew. Tommy's secret visits became less secret, his grandmother's disapproval grew sharper, and Daniel's silence stretched heavier. In the heart of it all stood Ayanna, the girl who had once walked away without seeking anything, now bound by threads of loyalty and suspicion she had never intended to weave. The bond had been formed in water and sealed in secrecy, but the land had ways of exposing all truths. Whispers in the saloon, mutterings in church, glances at the mercantile, they all pointed toward a collision that could not be avoided. For now Tommy laughed and Ayanna smiled, their small world untouched. But beyond the mesquite the storm was gathering, and it would soon test them all. Autumn came to the prairie with a gentler sun and cooler winds that swept over the grasses, stirring the earth with the fragrance of dust and dried leaves. The ranchers felt the change in the air, preparing for shorter days and longer nights. And in the town itself, the people turned their thoughts to the yearly harvest celebration. It was a festival older than the railroad tracks that had begun to creep westward, older than many of the saloons that now lined the main street. It had started as a small gathering, a way for neighbors to share food and give thanks for survival. But over the years, it had grown into something larger, drawing families from outlying ranches, and even merchants from other towns. For Daniel Hayes and his family, it had always been a marker of time, a reminder that another year had passed, another year endured. This time, however, the festival carried with it a current of unease. The weeks since Tommy's secret bond with Ayanna had not been easy. Whispers had wound their way from the saloon to the church pews, carried on the tongues of neighbors who never missed a chance to judge. Daniel had kept his silence, though the weight of it pressed hard. His mother's sharp words remained in his ears, bitter as the taste of old whiskey. Yet each evening he looked at his son, whose eyes glowed with life again, whose laughter echoed through the house as if the pond had never threatened to swallow him, and Daniel knew the source of that light. He owed it to Ayanna, whether he spoke it aloud or not. As the day of the festival approached, Tommy grew restless with excitement. For him, the thought of lanterns rising into the sky was magic itself. The idea that a slip of paper carrying a hope or prayer could float away into the night, borne by flame, toward some unseen heaven. He begged his father to take him, and Daniel agreed, though he sensed trouble waiting among the crowd. The boy then pleaded to bring Ayanna, his insistence clear in the way children make their wishes known, with persistence, with innocence, with the certainty that what matters to them should matter to everyone. Daniel hesitated, but when he looked into his son's eager face, he knew he could not refuse. He went to Ayanna's camp 2 days before the festival, standing awkwardly at the edge of her fire as she prepared her herbs. He told her of the celebration, of the lanterns, of his boy's desire to see her there. She listened without expression, her hands busy as she tied bundles of sage. At first she shook her head, for she knew the weight of eyes that followed her in town, knew the whispers that clung like burrs. But Daniel's voice carried an honesty that was difficult to ignore, and she saw the way he lowered it, as if confessing a secret even to himself. Finally she agreed, not for him, but for the boy who would not be dissuaded. When the day arrived, the town was alive with motion. The square had been decorated with streamers and lanterns, the scent of roasted corn and smoked meat hanging in the crisp air. Children ran in small clusters, their laughter rising above the twang of fiddles and the calls of vendors. Women laid out pies on long tables, Men gathered in knots to share news and wagers, and the air carried that mixture of celebration and tension that belonged uniquely to the West, where joy was never entirely separated from hardship. Daniel arrived with his son dressed in his best shirt, his boots freshly polished. Ayanna walked beside them, her simple clothing neat, her hair braided with care, a small shell tied at the end of one braid that caught the light as she moved. The crowd noticed at once. Some turned away with narrowed eyes, some whispered behind hands, and others simply watched in silence, uncertain but curious. Tommy clung proudly to Ayanna's hand, oblivious to the stares, his excitement too great to be diminished. The program began as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon with strokes of orange and violet. A platform had been built near the fountain, draped in cloth and lanterns. The mayor gave a short speech about the year's hardships and blessings, his voice booming over the crowd, followed by a hymn sung by the town's children. People applauded politely, though their eyes often strayed to the figure of the Apache girl standing with the Hayes family. Then came the moment when children were invited to share verses and prayers before the lantern release. Tommy tugged at Ayanna's hand, his face glowing with anticipation. He wanted her to stand with him, to read with him, to be part of the ritual that bound the town together. At first she resisted, her feet rooted to the ground, but his pleading eyes broke through her hesitation. She allowed herself to be led to the platform, the crowd falling into a sudden hush as the two figures mounted the steps. The announcer, perhaps sensing the importance of the moment, handed Ayanna a small book of verses, his expression unreadable. She opened it slowly, her hands steady though her heart pounded beneath her ribs. Her voice began low, almost hesitant, but soon it grew stronger, flowing across the square with a clarity that surprised even her. She read the words in English, each syllable careful, her tone gentle yet firm. Then, without pausing, she repeated the prayer in her own tongue, the sounds rising like music, foreign yet strangely familiar. The crowd shifted uneasily, some frowning, some leaning closer, drawn despite themselves. The boy's face shone with joy as he joined in, stumbling through lines, mispronouncing words, his small voice weaving in and out of hers. The audience, at first silent, began to soften. Parents smiled at the child's determination. Children giggled when he stumbled. And gradually the air filled with a warmth that no prejudice could entirely quench. But not all hearts yielded. From the front row, Daniel's mother rose, her face hard, her voice cutting through the applause that followed. She stepped forward, her figure sharp against the lantern light, and spoke with the bitterness of grief that had never healed. She accused Daniel of allowing his son's mother to be replaced, accused Ayanna of stepping into a place that was not hers. Her words, carried by years of sorrow, fell upon the crowd with the weight of judgment. Ayanna stood still, her head lifted, her hand resting lightly on Tommy's shoulder. She did not respond at once, for she knew the power of silence. When she finally spoke, her words were soft, but they carried through the square. She said she could never replace the mother the boy had lost, could never erase the memory of the woman who had given him life. But she also said that the child deserved not emptiness, but comfort, not shadows, but light. And if she could offer that, then she would. Her words were simple, yet they rang with the unmistakable weight of truth. The crowd fell quiet. Whispers died on lips. It was the boy's voice that broke the silence as he pressed closer to her and told his grandmother that she made him smile again, that his mother would have wanted that. The innocence of the statement, the purity of it, struck harder than any argument. Even the hardest faces in the crowd softened, and even Daniel's mother, though her lips pressed thin, faltered in her resolve. The announcer, seizing the moment, turned the attention back to the ceremony. Lanterns were lit, one by one, small flames glowing against the darkening sky. People carried them to the fountain, holding them carefully as the warm air lifted them upward. One by one they rose, floating into the night, each carrying a message, a wish, a memory. The sight drew gasps of wonder from children and murmurs of reverence from adults. Daniel stood near the fountain, his son between him and Ayanna, watching as their lantern lifted into the sky. For a moment, the three of them formed a small circle of light in the midst of the crowd. Around them, lanterns drifted higher, glowing like stars against the dark. Behind them, Daniel's mother lingered, her face shadowed by sorrow, but her eyes softened by something she could not yet name. The festival ended with music and laughter, with families gathering close and children running under the drifting lanterns. But for Daniel Hayes, for his son, and for the Apache woman who had walked beside them, the night marked something greater than celebration. It was a trial faced before the eyes of the town, a test of dignity and belonging. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, the light of the lanterns carried the promise that the bond formed in water and secrecy had begun to take root in the open air. The lanterns from the festival had long since drifted into the night sky, their light swallowed by distance, yet their memory lingered in the town like the afterglow of a fire that refused to die out. For days afterward, people spoke of the Apache girl who had stood on the stage with the Hayes boy, her voice carrying prayers in two tongues. Some remembered the way the child's laughter had filled the square as she read beside him. Others repeated the sharp words of Daniel's mother, and still others held fast to their old suspicions, unwilling to let kindness alter their views. The town was divided, though not in neat lines. There were those who found themselves surprised by the strength of her presence, and those who hardened their hearts convinced that what they had witnessed was no more than spectacle. For Ayanna, the return to her camp was quiet. She had not gone to the festival for recognition. She had gone because the boy had asked her, because his small hands had tugged at hers with a hope she could not refuse. Yet even as she returned to the solitude of her shelter, she knew she could not undo what had been set in motion. The world beyond the mesquite grove had turned its eyes upon her, and whether they were filled with admiration or suspicion, she could not step back into anonymity. She gathered her herbs, tended her fire, spoke to no one, but at night she sat awake longer than usual, staring into the embers, replaying the glow of lanterns and the words she had spoken in front of strangers. On the ranch, the aftermath was no less complex. Daniel felt the weight of his decision to let her stand with his son. He knew the whispers in the saloon had grown sharper, that some men now questioned his judgment, others his pride. Yet he also knew what he had seen in his boy's eyes: joy unclouded by grief, laughter that had been absent since the day the pond nearly stole him away. Each time Tommy ran across the yard, calling for his horse, or returned with his pockets full of feathers and stones Ayanna had given him, Daniel felt a quiet gratitude that dulled the sting of gossip. He told himself that a father's duty was not to his neighbor's tongues but to the heart of his child. Tommy himself seemed unchanged by the whispers. He continued to visit Ayanna, sometimes openly now, with less fear of discovery. He carried his drawings to her camp, listened to her stories, learned from her the ways of the earth. She showed him how to read the wind, how to know the signs of rain from the curl of clouds, how to respect the life around him. He absorbed these lessons eagerly, his young mind molding itself around her words as if they were truths he had always known but never heard spoken aloud. For him, she was not a stranger of another people. She was simply Ayanna, the one who had saved him, the one who gave him courage in the dark. Daniel's mother, however, wrestled with a storm she could not name. Her grief for her daughter-in-law was a wound that had never healed, and she felt each smile her grandson gave to the Apache woman as a betrayal of memory. She watched the boy grow more attached to Ayanna, and her heart hardened in defense of the past. Yet slowly a fissure appeared in her resistance. In the quiet nights, she sometimes heard the boy sleep without the whimpering cries that had haunted him since the pond, and she realized he no longer woke trembling. She saw him laugh again, play without shadows, clinging to his steps, and though it pained her to admit it, she knew the change came from Ayanna's presence. The struggle tore at her, anger that the boy turned to another, and reluctant gratitude that he was happy again. The town itself remained restless. At Sunday service, some spoke in hushed voices of reconciliation, of the need to judge people by their deeds rather than their blood. Others crossed their arms and shook their heads, unwilling to allow an Apache woman into the circle of their trust. Yet for every hardened heart, there was a softened one, and though few admitted it aloud, the sight of the girl with the Hayes boy at the festival had planted seeds that even suspicion could not uproot. The season turned colder, the wind sharper, and the prairie took on the silver hue of approaching winter. Life pressed on, as it always did. Daniel worked harder than before. his hands rough with rope and wood, his shoulders bent under the weight of both cattle and unspoken worries. Yet when he returned home and saw his son's bright eyes, the load seemed lighter. He began to understand that some debts could not be paid in coin, that some gifts demanded only acceptance. He did not speak often to Ayana, but when he did, his words carried more respect than before, and his silences were no longer heavy with suspicion. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and painted the sky with streaks of fire, Tommy convinced his father and grandmother to walk with him to the edge of the prairie. He carried a small lantern he had saved from the festival, its paper sides patched where it had torn. Ayana was there, waiting near her camp, her presence quiet as the dusk. The boy urged them all to gather, to light the lantern once more and send it skyward. At first the grandmother resisted, her lips pressed into a hard line. But when she saw the hope in the child's face, she yielded. Together they lit the flame, the warm glow rising between them. Daniel placed his hand on his son's shoulder. Ayana stood beside them, and at last the grandmother, trembling, reached out as well. For a moment, 3 generations in a stranger bound by circumstance held the fragile lantern, lifting it into the night. The paper caught the air, the flame carried it upward, and they watched as it drifted away, smaller and smaller against the dark sky. In that moment, words were unnecessary. The sight of the light rising was enough to hold back doubt and grief, if only for a little while. Ayana did not imagine herself part of their family, nor did she seek to replace anyone's memory. She remained who she was, her feet grounded in her people's ways, her spirit tied to the land that raised her. Yet as the lantern faded into the stars, even she allowed herself to believe that perhaps she had found a place where her presence mattered beyond survival. She had become part of something she had not sought, but which had nonetheless claimed her. The healing of a boy, the shifting of a family, the possibility that even in a land hardened by dust and division, there could be room for understanding. The prairie night closed in around them, filled with the soft sounds of crickets and the distant call of coyotes. Daniel turned back toward the ranch with his son at his side, his mother following slowly, her thoughts tangled but her heart less certain of its anger. Ayana remained for a moment longer, her eyes lifted to the sky where the lantern had disappeared. She knew the West would never be free of suspicion, never simple, never safe. But as she stood in the glow of the fading fire, she felt a quiet certainty settle within her. Whatever else came, the boy she had pulled from the water now carried her presence in his laughter, and that was something no whisper, no judgment could take away. And so the story that began at the muddy edge of a pond found its echo in the clear expanse of the prairie sky. What had started as a single act of instinct, a rescue without thought of reward, had grown into a bond that defied lines of blood and prejudice. It was not triumph in the grand sense, not a victory sung in ballads or etched into history books, but it was a triumph nonetheless. It was the triumph of a child's joy restored, of a man's gratitude finding form, of an old woman's grief bending toward acceptance, and of a young woman's place in the world shifting, quietly, irrevocably, into something new. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories, and share this one with your friends and family, because some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.